keeping everything going here on the next segment of the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast. We're going to talk about OTAs a little bit, but before I do that, I want to remind you guys once again, if you have any questions or comments you want to make, use the tip and donations link you see on your screen, GSMCPodcast.net. This way, I can see your question pop up on my screen, read your question or comment on air, and just get your guys' perspective on anything I say or on any of the topics. It's a massive help for the show if you're able to do that, so please use the tip and donations link, GSMCPodcast.net. But in saying that, we'll move on and talk about OTAs because now we're sort of almost getting closer and closer to real football. You know, it's not just conditioning and just workouts. It is a little bit more team-oriented. You have some of the offense going up against some of the defense. Still no pads, but it is something. You know, we're getting a bit more competition out there for these teams. A few of them started on Monday and a couple more began on Tuesday. Some teams had their second days today, so just on some early takeaways from it, who's there, who wasn't there to start the OTA period. Justin Jefferson, there were some doubts about him maybe being there, maybe not being there. He ended up not showing up to the OTAs portion of the offseason for the Vikings and also missing the volunteer program in 2023. He did show up to the mandatory portion in June last year when the same situation occurred with his contract. So that mandatory minicamp is set to be in June, again, June 4th and June 6th to be specific. So that's really the date I have penciled in to keep an eye on for this situation and how it's going. You know, if he follows suit as he did last year, you know, this really isn't something to really talk about. If he follows the same pattern, you probably would expect the same result as it happened last year. He missed some portion of it, but he ended up playing the majority of the season, suffering injuries throughout it. But if he doesn't show up on June 4th and June 6th, then a lot of antennas will be raised as to him taking it a bit more serious this year, not attending these mandatory practices. So that's something to look out for. He didn't show up on Monday. I mentioned Micah Parsons also wasn't present to start the OTAs for the Dallas Cowboys, as well as CeeDee Lamb. Christian McCaffrey and Brandon Ayuk also were two more that weren't present for the San Francisco 49ers to start OTAs. Brandon Ayuk obviously dealing with the contract negotiations, and Christian McCaffrey just deciding not to show up there. Not mandatory yet, so they don't have to be there. And also, a surprise for the 49ers as well, a pleasant surprise. Nick Bosa was present for the OTAs the last few years. He hasn't been there during this portion, usually working out in Florida. He shows up earlier this year in Santa Clara, so that's a positive for the 49ers. And also in Los Angeles, or in the state of California, I should say, Matthew Stafford showed up for the OTAs. You know, that was another question because he was dealing with wanting more guaranteed money from the Los Angeles Rams past 2024. It was an optimal opportunity for him not to show up, again, because this portion is voluntary. But despite the contract issues, Matthew Stafford showed up to the OTAs, is still looking for that security, but he showed up. That I'm sure is a relief for the Los Angeles Rams, that he is still focused on this team and showing up. It said a lot to me that he did show up, as well as Tua Tagovailoa. Similar situation with him, trying to figure out a contract, in question about whether or not he was going to show up. He also was present to start the OTAs period of this part of the offseason for the Miami Dolphins. Quarterbacks are the usual ones that hold out, sort of. These big name stars are the ones that usually make the headlines about attending OTAs or not. But now we have a kicker, Eddie Pinheiro, missing the start of OTAs. I just thought this story was funny. I've never heard of a kicker missing OTAs or just holding out, I guess, for a new contract. He is on the last year of a 2-year extension he received in 2023, so he's looking for a raise. He is earning $2.5 million right now per year. That's 21st among kickers right now. Jake Elliott and Justin Tucker make the most at $6 million per year, so he wants some more money. He wants an extension, so he's holding out. Pretty funny, pretty unique situation here for a kicker to hold out, but that is that. Other In other news around the NFL, Rashee Rice was present for the Kansas City Chiefs, even though he is dealing with off the field issues, legal issues with that car accident he had down in Dallas. Then there was another, I want to say, assault charge. I don't have the actual facts on here to specify, so I won't comment on it too much. But there was another issue, legal issue that he was dealing with. But regarding all that, and despite all of that, he showed up to the OTA part of the offseason. He is still expected to receive a punishment from the NFL, so that is something to look out for. But he is present for the Chiefs, as well as Kendrick Bourne and Matthew Judon were two more that weren't at the Patriots start of OTAs. Kendrick Bourne still recovering from the ACL injury, so there was some warning there that he could potentially not show up. As for Matthew Judon, according to head coach Gerard Mayo, he has been in and out all offseason, so it's not anything new. It's similar to what he's done in seasons before, so it's not something new that he hasn't ever done. But those two guys aren't there to start OTAs for the Patriots. And also, one of the biggest news that I'm sure I will talk about more later on, T. Higgins has not signed his franchise tender as of this moment. And because he hasn't done that, he's unable to perform in the team's OTAs period of the offseason. That's a story that I'm sure will develop more and more. He didn't get the contract extension that he wanted. He was franchise tagged and still remains the only franchise tag player to not receive an extension. So I'm sure he's feeling a sort of way about that. You know, the Bengals have been adamant that they're not going to trade him, that they want him to play this year, but who sort of caves first now at this point? Him opting out to not take part in this voluntary, again, part of the offseason is something to monitor when it becomes mandatory, like a mandatory minicamp and things like that. He would want to be there. It is mandatory, but if he doesn't sign this tender, he can't realistically be there because of the rules. So if he decides to sign it or take in some of the fines that will come, I'm sure, by missing the mandatory part of the offseason will be something to keep an eye on. But that pretty much does it for the early takeaways of OTAs. Just to start off here, you know, we are only in the early part of it. They will continue on throughout this week and I'm sure into the weekend before it gets more serious into the mandatory part of the offseason. But it is exciting. Again, the OTAs, there is more development there, more actual football, but you know, we just have to wait a little longer for training camp and for preseason, and then before you know it, the season will be here. But it is a lot easier said than done. There is a few months left, but for right now, that is where we'll leave that topic. And we have one more to talk about on the agenda. The Jacksonville Jaguars and their new renovations coming to their stadium is set to be done by 2027, but for right now, I will give you all the details on how it will look and what is coming to Jacksonville with these new renovation plans. So don't go anywhere. You're listening to the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast.